Ethics Untangled is brought to you by IDEA, the Ethics Centre at the University of Leeds. To find out more about IDEA, go to ahc.leeds.ac.uk/ethics. Firstly, just in case it wasn't obvious from the title, this episode has a content warning. It contains frank descriptions of sex and pornography, so please use discretion. Feminist critiques of pornography go back a long way and take many forms. One charge that has been levelled against porn is that it is inauthentic in ways that might be harmful to women. There's also been a move among some porn producers to produce material that's more authentic, citing arguments that appeal to both ethical and aesthetic considerations, and which sometimes blur the distinction between the two. Rosa Vince, a philosopher based at IDEA, the Ethics Centre at the University of Leeds, thinks the ethical arguments, at least, are unconvincing. Rosa, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much for having me.
Great. So I wondered if you could start by just telling me, where does this demand for authenticity in porn come from?
Yeah, so it comes from a few places where you might not expect agreement to come from. So you get a common critique from anti-porn feminists that mainstream porn is insufficiently authentic. You get some anti-porn feminists saying that what's wrong with mainstream porn or most porn is that it's telling lies about what women want. It's telling lies about what women enjoy. But at the same time, you get feminist porn advocates and creators of feminist porn saying what's special about our material is that it is more authentic, that it tells the truth about what women want. There's something more authentic about this material. That's supposed to be a selling point. And you'll also get ordinary porn viewers, particularly feminist porn viewers, saying there's authenticity in this kind of material and that's what's preferable about it.
Yeah. So you've used the phrase feminist porn there. So could you just tell us, well, what's that? What's feminist porn?
Yeah. So people ordinarily mean something like feminist porn it's still porn, right? It's not what people used to call erotica. It's not this kind of soft, really romantic version of sexually explicit material. It's still porn, but it's different to mainstream porn, both in terms of the content. There might be different kinds of acts, there might be different kinds of lighting, different style, and it's different in the production and how it's made. And I struggle to define it a little bit because in another paper I criticize this category. I don't think it really works as a category. But that's the general idea, that there's something different about it in terms of the content, something different about it in terms of the production. So, for example, you've got the Feminist Porn Awards, a series of awards that ran for a decade, organised by a sex shop in Canada, where they defined feminist porn, making something eligible for one of their Feminist Porn Awards. They defined that, I think they had 4 criteria. It's the material supposed to challenge stereotypes, supposed to have good working conditions, supposed to have realistic pleasure depicted, and importantly for what I'm talking about here, this material is supposed to incorporate the performer's own desires into it.
Yeah, okay. So there's a few different sorts of ideas in play there, aren't there? There's the idea that the porn should not be kind of in general telling lies about, as you say, what women want or enjoy. And then there's a kind of separate demand that actually the actual kind of interests and demands and pleasure of the performers should be part of what's going on in the film or whatever.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, okay. It's interesting because, I mean, so the first time I kind of started studying philosophy was back in the 90s, and the kind of feminist take on porn, at that point, seemed to be basically just completely anti, right? The idea was porn was inherently harmful to women, it was anti-feminist, and basically it was to be opposed, right? Either just, through critiques or even potentially through kind of censorship and so on. But some feminists, like I said, things have changed a little bit right now. So we now have feminists who don't think that porn is kind of intrinsically to be rejected, and there could be a kind of better version of porn. And that's kind of where the demand for feminist porn comes from.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah, okay. that's really interesting. So I take it the idea why we should want authenticity in porn. So there's actually almost a kind of aesthetic element to that as well. So there's a kind of moral element to it, right? It's supposed to be something that's morally required. Porn would be kind of morally better if it better reflected people's actual desires and so on. But also, there's a suggestion that viewers might enjoy it more, right?
Yeah.
Is that something that there's evidence for, that viewers actually do prefer authentic porn?
Yeah, so there are a few, but not many, not enough studies on what women are looking for when they're searching for porn, what kinds of things, what kind of criteria they have in mind. It would be great if there were more studies about what women are looking for, what feminists are looking for. And one of the things that comes up in the studies that do exist is authenticity. So people are saying, this is what's good about this material. It's more authentic, and it's coming from, as you say, both an ethical kind of perspective of thinking, well, I feel better about my consumption of porn if I think that the performers are really enjoying what they're doing. But also, people just like find it hotter if it looks to them really authentic. And I think those are connected to one another as well. We enjoy things more when we feel good about them. And I think, as well as these couple of studies that exist, this is also something I hear quite a lot from other feminists. Part of my motivation for this paper was a friend saying to me, "Oh, I only watch feminist porn because it's more authentic," and I thought there was something a little bit weird about that comment, but we can get into why I think it's weird later on.
Okay. I didn't want to throw your friend under the bus here, but it might be interesting to kind of, I suppose there is an interesting question about kind of what's going on there, to what extent that is a judgment about the ethics of the activity versus like just a kind of, how enjoyable it is. I wanted to ask, so I'd actually mentioned this before, but it seems like there's two kind of demands here. There's a demand that in general, porn should give a more accurate overall or more representative picture of what women enjoy, as opposed to just kind of catering to men, I suppose, is the charge. And secondly, that specific porn films should make use of the actual desires and preferences of the female performers themselves. So do you think those two ideas are separable? That's one question, right? So could you kind of aim for the general representativeness without the making use of desires and so on?
Yeah, I think absolutely these can come apart. And I think sometimes when people are asking for authenticity, they're kind of asking for both. And I think one way in which they might be really tightly connected is if you have the kind of view that if you think there are certain acts that no women ever enjoy, and this isn't a position that I find plausible, but if you have the position that there are some acts that no women ever enjoy, then these two claims come together, because you'll be saying both the performer on screen doesn't enjoy this act that they're performing, and other women in the world don't really enjoy it. So that's where those two versions of the claim might come really tightly together. But they do come apart because you can want to really cater to a female audience and have a really kind of linear script of what's going to happen in a scene, and the performer isn't really involved in the design of that script. That you're aiming to capture what women in general tend to want. And on the other hand, you could be making some kind of really expressive kind of confessional or avant-garde kind of thing where you're thinking, don't worry about what the audience thinks. We're making something for us. So you can attempt to do one or the other. I think these two versions of the authenticity demand map onto two broad goals that feminists tend to have. I think when people are thinking about, well, we want porn to tell the truth about what women in general want, that tends to map onto the goal of wanting to make things better for women in general. Yeah. It tends to map onto that kind of ethical demand. And when you're saying, well, I want authenticity in the performers' performances, I want them to really want to be doing the things that they're doing and really like the things that end up on screen, then that tends to map onto this other kind of ethical commitment of wanting the performers' experiences to be better, for them to have a better time on set.
Yes. Well, let's maybe take the second of those first then. Do you think that authenticity in porn, I suppose in the way it's actually been kind of sought and been carried out, does it result in better conditions for the porn performers themselves?
No, I don't think it does. So I think if authenticity did generate better conditions, better experiences for performers, then you'd expect to have much better working conditions in feminist porn, which tends to be the material that aims for authenticity, than you get in mainstream porn. But what we hear from performers is that you get good conditions in feminist porn, you get bad conditions in feminist porn. You get good conditions in mainstream porn, you get bad conditions in mainstream porn. And one doesn't really predict whether you're going to get good or bad working conditions. That doesn't track whether the material is listed as feminist porn or not. One worry I have is that demanding authenticity in porn can actually risk making things worse. Because if we see in other kinds of industries, if you say, we want you to bring your whole self to work. We want you to feel like you're part of the family. We want you to be doing this, for the love of it. Then that puts real working conditions and workers' rights and those kinds of demands in the backseat and foregrounds that, you're doing this because you really love it.
Yeah.
And in other industries, it's easy to see how that can enable exploitation rather than combat it. So I think there's a real danger in saying, well, what we want from our porn is for the performers to bring, their real Desires on screen, and for them to just do what they feel like doing in front of the camera. That might create worse working conditions rather than better ones.
Yeah, I suppose one thing that it might result in is actually performances that are in some way actually less authentic, or certainly inauthentic in a different way. And like, you could think about other examples, like you say, that this kind of thing might happen in other industries. So you can imagine like a restaurant where they say all our waiting staff really enjoy their work, right, and we want them to bring their whole self into work, and we want them to be really enjoying every minute of waiting tables in this restaurant, right? And like, ideally that would be great, right? The goal is desirable, right? It would be great if everybody was really enjoying their work all the time. But actually, realistically, what that's going to lead to is people pretending to enjoy themselves a lot of the time, right? Because that's part of the demand that their employer is asking of them, and they end up putting a kind of mask on to try and fulfill that demand, but it's not actually authentic, right? And you can imagine the same thing happening on a porn set, I suppose.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Like, it would be lovely if everybody had a better time at work. It's completely understandable to want that to be the case. But when you make that part of what you're asking for, when you make that part of what you're advertising as well, then performers and workers in any industry, whatever it is, they have to not only do their job, they also have to perform loving the job. And that's just extra labor.
Yes, yeah. And you might just think actually that it's just outside the scope of what it's legitimate to demand of an employee, right? In return for, essentially, for wages, right? To actually expect somebody to bring their whole self to work, right? That's actually quite a big demand on somebody. And you might think, actually, if you're going to ask that, you really do need to be paying quite a lot more than you are paying somebody who's just expected to turn up and do the job.
Yeah, exactly. I think it is quite an invasive demand.
Yeah.
To want to have access to what people really desire, what they're really feeling, what they're really they're bringing some of themselves to it. That's quite a lot to ask for, and it is somewhat invasive. And I think this is what I found a little unnerving about the comment from my friend. That I think, as well as it being something that bosses, I don't think, have a right to demand, it's something that consumers don't have a right to demand either. But I think there's something a little bit weird about saying what I want from my porn, or from my worker in a restaurant or whatever. What I want from them is them to wear their heart on their sleeve. I want to see the real them. There's something, I think, a little creepy about that.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, absolutely. I can see how that's a bit concerning. Yeah. All right. So that's the question of whether authenticity in porn, however you define it, would result in better conditions for the performers themselves. But then there was also that more general kind of ethical demand that porn should be more representative of the tastes and desires of, particularly of women generally, and that actually porn as it stands tells lies about what women want. So, I mean, firstly, do you think that's true? Do you think porn does tell lies about what women want? And secondly, do you think that's a problem? Do you think that's something that's harmful to women?
Cool, yeah. So this is a common worry that porn tells lies about what women in general want. And I think it's not obvious to me that it does. So when particularly anti-porn feminists are making claims like porn tells lies about what women want, they often don't give examples of what those kinds of lies are. Sometimes they do. And I think when you try and list, well, what are the things that porn's telling lies about? What are the things that women actually want? As soon as you start trying to come up with examples on either side of that, then you see the problems.
Yes. So examples of things that porn typically depicts that women definitely don't want, right? That's part of it. But it's also, there must be things that women do want to see that they aren't being able to see.
Exactly. And it's just the case that there isn't a list of all the things that women, that all women like, and that there's no one thing that all women hate, and there's no one thing that all women like. So when some examples do get brought up, so one example that gets talked about relatively often, a philosopher called Rebecca Wiston brings this up, is anal sex. Now the claim, if the claim is porn is lying and saying that women like anal sex, or saying that all women like anal sex, well, that's obviously an implausible claim. If the claim is that porn is lying and saying that some women like anal sex, well, that's not a lie at all. It's just not a lie that some women like anal sex. It's not a lie that some women like all of the other things that people can think of. BDSM comes up particularly often in these kinds of things. People say that, well, no women like choking or hair pulling, things like that. And some do. Some do. That's the problem. And as soon as we start to try and think of, okay, well, maybe some women like anal sex, but no women like this other thing, or maybe some women like hair pulling, but no women like this other thing. As soon as we start trying to come up with those lists, then we're in really dangerous territory.
That sounds right, but I wonder, I mean, presumably the claim can't be that, you know, for any given kind of act that's depicted in porn, 0 women enjoy it, because like you name an act, somebody's going to enjoy it.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, exactly.
But so I take it the claim is something more like overall, the story that porn tells about what women want is somewhat unrepresentative. And you would think that that might be likely to be true, given that porn, I mean, is this still true that porn is largely kind of aimed at men rather than women, and therefore it's going to be geared towards giving men what they would like women to want rather than what women actually want, if that makes sense? So there's going to be a kind of general, it's not going to map exactly onto kind of people's preferences overall. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so I think it's probably right that porn isn't going to get the proportion of things that people like and don't like right. So it might be the case that, I don't know, some large proportion of porn depicts women enjoying a particular act that actually only a small number of women like that act. That might be true, that porn is misleading in that way. But I think it would be really hard to work that out. I think porn is probably getting men's desires wrong a lot of the time as well. But I think even if porn were getting something seriously wrong about which kinds of things people like and don't like, that isn't going to be a problem on its own. I think that when feminists say, oh, I'm worried about men learning from porn that women like anal sex, what they're trying to say And what they often say explicitly is, I'm worried about them seeing that women like this thing and going home and coercing their partners into this act. Or I'm worried about men seeing this thing in porn and then doing this thing to their partner without their permission. And I think that's quite a different problem that has nothing to do with whether those acts are authentically desired by many or most women generally, because it's seriously wrong to coerce somebody into doing a sex act that they ordinarily love, just as much as it is to coerce them into a sex act that they don't ordinarily love. So you can imagine somebody seeing anal sex in porn and going to their partner and saying, hey, I've learned that, actually loads of women like this thing. Do you want to try it? And their partner going, no, I would hate that. Yeah. Exactly. If they go, fair enough, we'll do something else, then there's no real problem there. So the problem, authenticity is a red herring here. It's it's irrelevant whether porn's telling the truth about how many women like a particular thing, because it would be just as wrong to coerce women into doing something that they do like. So feminists might think they're worried about authenticity, but actually they're worried about something that's kind of unrelated to whether porn is telling lies about what women like.
Right. Yeah. Okay. I can totally see that. I mean, it seems like there's one thing we might be worried about is that this critique of porn is somewhat taking the responsibility out of the hands of the men themselves, right? So if the thought is, men watch porn and then they go and kind of coerce their partners into, carrying out particular acts that they've seen in porn, like, it's not the porn's fault that they've done that. It's their fault that they did that, right? But you can also see how kind of, in general, there might be, I suppose, like, when you're thinking about coercion, there's potentially a spectrum of things that you might be worried about here, right? So it might not just be kind of straightforward, you have to do this, or there's going to be consequences, right? It could be that, having watched a lot of porn, men might kind of get an idea of what women like, which then becomes kind of somewhat normative in a way, and that they then kind of expect women to like those things, and they kind of might shame them for not liking those things, or think that they're kind of not sort of proper women if they don't like these things, and that kind of might just play into some problematic interactions between people. I don't know. Is that something that we should worry about?
Yeah, I think that's a fair enough worry. If it were the case that men didn't treat women poorly generally, then it might not matter at all. Because it might always unfold exactly like we've just given an example of. It might always unfold like oh, you don't like that thing? Cool, we'll do something else. But I take your point that we live in a society where coercion, particularly along gendered lines, is common, and is reinforced by a lot of things in media broadly, in all kinds of entertainment. And if porn gives the impression that there are particular things that women tend to like, and if those things are particularly uncommon for women to actually enjoy, then that might end up with there being more coercion into those things. I take that point. I think it's not the main thing I want to argue on this topic, but I do think it would be surprising if the blame for that lay with porn. Because if porn is communicating, look, women enjoy these things, you've still got to get the message that it's okay to coerce them into it from somewhere. And that message, I think, is harder to pin. It is hard to pin on porn. That seems to be something that people learn much earlier on. Yeah. And I think it's much more plausible that this message that men can do what they like to women, that men can push women around, it's much more plausible that that message is reinforced in other places, in places where it's easier to get a message across. I mean, people often watch porn with the sound off. There's a difficult question as to how people get messages from porn at all. Such that I think other kinds of media, other kinds of social phenomenon are much better candidates for where that kind of message is learned.
Yes. Okay. So there's a kind of there's a broader problem of kind of patriarchy in society in general, right? And if that wasn't there, then the kind of misrepresentativeness of porn wouldn't in itself be a problem. It only becomes a problem when you've got these conditions in which men are able to treat women badly and get away with it, basically. Yeah, that makes sense. Okay. And one of the things that you say is that, I suppose this is related to that point, is that people shouldn't take porn as educative. So what do you mean by that?
Yeah, so I think one of the reasons that people ask for authenticity in porn is they think, okay, so there's lots of bad stuff in porn, there's lots of bad information, let's make better stuff. And this is an idea that I think was popularized by Annie Sprinkle, saying the answer, I can't remember the exact quote, but it's something like, the answer to bad porn isn't no porn, it's better porn.
Yes.
And this is quite a common response. And there's something in that. I think we want our media to be better generally, but I think there's a real danger in reinforcing this idea that porn is where you learn about sex from. If you think that we're currently learning bad things from porn and we should learn good things from porn, you're really leaning into the idea that we should learn from porn. And I think that's a mistake. I think we should be treating porn as entertainment rather than as a how-to guide, a replacement for sex education. And I think, we wouldn't try and learn about how to do martial arts from martial arts movies. We see them as entertainment. We might be inspired by them. We might go, oh, that seems like a cool thing to do. But we wouldn't use that as the instruction guide, And I think if we start saying that porn should teach good messages, porn should tell us the truth about what women want, whatever that is, then we're really buying into this idea that porn should teach us things. And I think that's a mistake. We're trying to turn it into something that it isn't. And I think that's a dangerous thing to do. And I think there's also some evidence to suggest that things are more likely to influence us if we let them. So if we believe that porn is a source of information, then we're more likely to take information away from it. If we believe that it's just entertainment or just fantasy or something, then we're less likely to take those messages. Then we're less likely to take messages away from it. Yeah. There was a study about where the researchers were looking into whether there was any kind of correlation between how much people consumed porn and whether they reliably used condoms.
Right.
And this, they expected to find that people who watched more porn used condoms less reliably. And they did find that correlation, but only among the participants who said that they saw porn as a source of information. And I'm so glad that they asked this question of asking the participants whether they saw porn as a source of information or not. Because that's a really useful thing to know. And there isn't. It turned out there isn't such a correlation when the viewers said, "No, I don't see porn as a source of information." So I think we need to stop treating it as a source of good or bad information and treat it as not as education, treat it as entertainment.
Yes, okay. I suppose there's a parallel here with kind of mainstream films, right? As you've sort of suggested already. So, it's not just that you wouldn't take martial arts films as an instruction manual to how to do martial arts. It's like there would be something very weird about people taking action films as like a guidance on how to relate to other people in any way, right? We all understand that's not what they are, right? They're a genre that, allows us to see some entertaining action, people kicking and shooting each other or whatever it is, right? And people in general, I think, don't take those things as in any way a kind of pattern for how they should behave in the real world. And the thought is, neither should porn be like that. And actually the worry that you have is if we're suggesting that porn should give better messages, then we're implicitly reinforcing the idea that it should give messages at all. And actually we'd be better off educating people to see it for what it is, which is just entertainment, which is kind of bears some kind of resemblance to real life, but it's quite a tenuous one, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, okay, great. Yes, I suppose probably running out of time, but one more question that I had was again about this kind of comparison between what you're talking about in the case of porn and other forms of more mainstream entertainment. And I think you mentioned rom-coms in the paper. And you can see there is a kind of parallel there in the way that rom-coms represent romantic relationships and, probably do that in quite an inaccurate way, really, on the whole. They're not really giving a kind of accurate picture of what romantic relationships are like in real life. But some people would actually say that that's quite harmful, right? Some people would use that as a critique of rom-coms and would say, actually, people do sometimes get unrealistic expectations about what romantic relationships are going to be like from watching films like that. And then that can actually harm them in their real relationships. So, I mean, do you think that's plausible that might happen? And what about the parallel with porn then? Even though we might say that people shouldn't look at porn as a source of information about sexual activity in the real world, but maybe in the same way, it's kind of inevitable that some people will, and therefore we should worry a bit about what the porn looks like.
So we want to be able to complain about dodgy messaging in all kinds of entertainment. I want to be able to complain about it in rom-coms particularly. But that doesn't mean we should ban rom-coms. Doesn't mean we should move from that to saying, well, rom-coms have to be super realistic now. The actors have to wear their hearts on their sleeves. They have to really fall in love or something. That'd be really worrying. Or that they have to capture the truth about the world in some way. That would be a strange thing to ask of all kinds of entertainment and art. And indeed, the problem with rom-coms, or one of the problems you might have with rom-coms, isn't that they're inaccurate. It's that they might be buying into some kind of dangerous idea that can cause more harm in the world. And the fact that it might cause more harm in the world is the problem, rather than whether it's accurate or not. Otherwise, a movie where everybody was nice to each other all the time would be similarly problematic in virtue of being unrealistic. But yeah, I think we should be able to make criticisms of rom-coms, and we should be able to make criticisms of porn. I think generally we should try and treat them more similarly. And one of the reasons for that is that when we treat porn as this kind of special kind of media that's unlike any other, then we buy into other kinds of dangerous myths. If we treat the sexually explicit material as special, then there's a risk of reinforcing this idea that sex is inherently dangerous, that women who have more sex are dangerous in some way. And I think part of the danger of anti-porn feminist rhetoric is that it contributes to real-world harm against sex workers in particular, but also against other women as well, by reinforcing things like slut-shaming, by kind of buying into this sexually explicit stuff is inherently more dangerous and dirty, and people who engage with that kind of thing are more dangerous and dirty. This idea, I think, is a very dangerous misogynistic idea that can be reinforced when we treat porn as special. So I think it would be really great if we could get to a point where we could criticize tropes in porn, criticize porn doing too much of one thing and not enough of another thing, in the same way that we can make those criticisms of other kinds of media, right, without inadvertently fueling a fire of things like slut shaming, things like stigmatization of sex workers. But it's just so difficult, because when we start saying, look, there's a problem with a load of porn, it's giving this harmful message, then people go, right, and that's the reason that porn is bad. Yes. And it shouldn't mean that. It shouldn't be able to be adopted like that. We should be able to talk about it in the same way that we can say there's a real problem with these Bond movies. Yeah. That doesn't mean spy movies are all bad. That doesn't mean we have to get rid of the porn. And I think that's That's a real difficulty when talking about these kinds of problems.
Yeah, okay, that's really, really interesting. I mean, there's quite a lot to unpack there, but I suppose the kind of general point that you're making is that the way we talk about mainstream entertainment and the way we talk about porn shouldn't be massively different, right? We should be free to make critiques of one or the other. And some of those critiques might be ethical. And we might say about some forms of porn, actually, this is kind of, this is a bit harmful and this probably isn't something that we want to see, right? Which is not the same as saying it should be banned. In the same way that you might say something about rom-coms, right? You might just kind of give a rom-com a bad review because actually it's just cheesy and it, the story that it tells about human relationships bears no resemblance to reality, and actually it might be kind of harmful because it's kind of playing into stereotypes and tropes and stuff that we don't, it would be better that if films didn't contain those things. Right. And as you say, like the problem with kind of having porn as this completely separate category is that it does play into things like slut shaming and so on, which are harmful in themselves. But I suppose kind of where you come down on what we should say about the product in either case, in some ways might come down to a question of responsibility, because it seems like if you're going to be kind of fairly sanguine about rom-coms and sanguine about porn, right, that's probably because you think actually consumers have a responsibility to understand what these things are, not take them as educational or as kind of blueprints for their actual lives, and exercise some kind of critical engagement with them rather than just kind of taking them as being real life, which they aren't, right? And whereas if you think actually there's a real problem with porn, but also with rom-coms, right, you might think, well, responsibility lies at least to some degree with the people who are actually making these products as well, right? And probably, realistically, there's going to be some responsibility on both sides, but kind of where you come down might come down to kind of how you apportion that responsibility. Does that sound right?
Yeah, I think it makes sense for there to be responsibility on all sides here. Creators should make better stuff, and consumers should try and understand what the role of what they're consuming in their lives, the role it's supposed that media is supposed to play in their lives. I don't want it to be the case that our solution to that is just, well, the creators have to make instructional content.
Yeah.
I also don't want it to be the case where we say just to consumers, like, this is your fault for not thinking enough. I think we have a broader kind of social responsibility to foster better understanding of relationships, of sex, of how we engage with media broadly. I don't think there's one place that needs to take all the responsibility for this.
Great. All right. Well, I think that's all we've got time for. So, Rosa Vince, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks for listening to Ethics Untangled, a podcast from IDEA, the Ethics Centre at the University of Leeds. IDEA brings ethics to life, blending in-depth theoretical inquiry with real-world experience to address the most complex ethical issues facing the world today. If you like the podcast, please leave us a rating and review. And to find out more about IDEA, including our Masters and PhD programmes and a wide range of consultancy services we offer, go to ahc.leeds.ac.uk/ethics.